So we're going to talk about some focus areas of the Common Core for English language arts. And there's a big difference that there's a difference that we want to talk about. The difference is of knowing the skill versus using the skill. We're not so much concerned about students knowing what nouns and verbs are. We're very concerned with them being able to use nouns and use verbs, to be able to identify language that they like in a text, and then to use that language, to be able to identify what is working in a text, what the author means, and then to be able to do that themselves as well. So that is a big focus of literacy in San Leandro Unified. Next slide. So there are, Celine, it looks like the slide is stuck. Is that? We are having some technical difficulties, folks. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so here we go. There are three main focus areas of English language arts in the Common Core. The first is practicing with complex texts and academic language. So you're going to see throughout the presentation tonight where teachers will be working with your students on helping them access language and ideas in increasingly difficult texts. And as they do that, learning the language to talk about those texts and the ideas in those texts, and also learning the language of the discipline that they're in. And so if it's English, they're going to learn to talk and think like readers and writers do. If they are in science class, they're going to learn to read and think and talk like scientists. If they're in math class, they're going to read and learn to think and talk like mathematicians, to use the language of that discipline. Next, Celine. The second focus area is reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from texts. When we present students with a text to read, and then we ask them to think about the ideas in there, we want them to use the ideas presented in the text to help them think. And so if they're reading a text in English class at the secondary level, and the teacher asks them to discuss a main idea from the text, we want them to be going back into the text to pull out lines, to identify lines that make them think that the main idea is a particular idea. So reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence is very important. And finally, building knowledge through content-rich texts is the last focus area. And what this means is that we want students to read lots of texts that are going to help them learn about the world. That's what that content-rich means. That they're going to build knowledge about the world through the texts that they read and interact with in class. So these are the three focus areas. And when we hone in a little bit further, when we zoom in a little bit further, Celine, will you advance? And you can keep going to bring all of them up. So we can see that it's really the focus on complex texts, academic language, grounding your ideas in evidence, and building and reading content-rich texts that will be the focus areas for literacy development in K through 12 in English language arts, in math, in science, in social studies, that these are the focus areas. Next slide. So we want to ask a question. We want you to type into the chat, which of these areas is the easiest and which of these are the most challenging for your child? And when we say which of these areas, is reading complex texts very difficult? Is using evidence difficult or easy? Is reading texts that build knowledge about the world easy, difficult? Are they interested in that? We'd love to hear what your experiences with your children are. And please write that in the chat box.
配隻上人啊，又配隻上人。我個女 Sophia 佢話寫最難。
Lacey, could you help us out with that and writing? Thank you. Okay. Do you find that when you chat with your children, and you ask them to support their ideas with an example, that they're able to do that? Is that easy for them? Is that difficult for them? Writing is difficult, okay. Writing is very difficult. I want to acknowledge that. It is so difficult, yes. Okay. So we'll show you some examples, writing. We're getting a lot of responses about writing, okay. All right, thank you. Celine, let's keep moving on. So it is true. Right now, there are some very difficult parts of teaching and learning right now. As we teach and learn in this virtual setting, we are trying to move mountains. And so we want to talk about, again, where your students' teachers will be focusing their work this year, specifically around literacy. So we're first going to start off by talking about reading. After we're done with reading, we'll move on to writing and then speaking and listening. And we're going to give you a little bit of a view of what your students will be doing and what the skills are that they need for literacy development, okay? So first, we're going to look at two texts from the elementary grades. These are two texts that your students might read. The first one, Where Do Polar Bears Live?, is a fictional story. And the second, the one on the right, 14 Cows for America, is an informational text. So reading literature and reading informational text are both important parts of developing literacy in the early grades. So we're going to take a look at each one of these. Celine, you can click and it'll advance. Okay. So let's take a look at this story. This is the story. This is an excerpt from Polar Bears. I'm going to talk about what makes this text difficult and what the focus areas would be for a student in that grade. So this is grade 2 to 3. This island is covered with snow. No trees grow. Nothing has green leaves. The land is as white as far as you can see. Then something small and round and black pokes up out of the snow. A black nose sniffs the air. Then a smooth white head appears. A mother polar bear heaves herself out of her den. A cub scrambles after her. When the cub was born 4 months ago, he was no bigger than a guinea pig. Blind and helpless, he snuggled in his mother's fur. He drank her milk and grew, safe from the long Arctic winter. So, this is a text from grades 2 to 3. And you'll notice that there are many single syllable words. Most sentences are very simple sentences. But if you take a look at the red highlighted text, a mother polar bear heaves herself out of her den, you'll notice that there's that word heaves. That's a difficult vocabulary word, a difficult word for students to understand what that means. And so students would need to be able to use clues from the sentence to be able to understand what the mother polar bear is doing. The highlighted portion in yellow that starts with blind and helpless shows a different sentence structure. So whereas the rest of the sentences are very simple, this one starts with a phrase blind and helpless. And it refers to the little polar bear cub. But students would need to understand that those two words relate to that word he. And so helping students, so your teachers will be helping students to understand those things to think about as they read and how to move through a text to be able to understand them. If we look at the informational text, again, this comes from 14 Cows. Again, I'll read it to you. I'm going to read just the two sentences that are highlighted. The remote village waits for a story to be told. Actually, I'll read the whole thing. News travels slowly to the corner of Kenya. As Kameli nears his village, he watches a herd of bull giraffes cross the open grassland. He smiles. He has been away a long time. A girl sitting under a guava tree sees him first and cries out to the others. The children run to him with the speed and grace of cheetahs. He greets them with a gentle touch on his head, a warrior's blessing. The rest of the tribe soon surrounds Kameli. These are his people. These are the Maasai. So this is an informational text. It almost sounds like a story, but it's giving information. In yellow, you can see these two sentences that are somewhat complex. So the remote village waits for a story to be told, and the children run to him with the speed and grace of cheetahs. That is figurative language. We know that a remote village cannot speak, but the author is trying to communicate an idea with that language. In the sentence, the children run to him with the speed and grace of cheetahs, that is a simile. And the author is trying to explain how making a comparison from the children to the cheetahs. And so these are kinds of sentences that make reading difficult for students, but also these are the kind of sentences that the author uses to communicate a deeper idea about the information they're presenting. And so it's important for students not only to be able to read to understand the text, but to read through those deeper layers. Next slide. At the upper grades, it's the same kind of thing. Students will be reading texts, novels like The Grapes of Wrath. And in these texts as well, there are going to be multiple layers of understanding that the students have to interpret. The man took off his dark stained hat and stood with a curious humility in front of the screen. His humility was insistent. So again, here the author is using figurative language. And so your students will be working on how to understand that figurative language and the multiple meanings that the words provide. But they'll also have to understand at these higher grades some language that is informed by the region and the people that the author is writing about. And so the words sandwiches and the phrase for quite a piece have to do with the local language of a particular region. And so students would have to build background knowledge about that region in order to understand why those words and why those phrases are being used. And they are.
And I tell you stuff. You know, school. See, we're just.
Next slide.
Oops. So we have on this screen a couple examples of text from the math books that your students are using in San Leandro Unified, or Eureka curriculum. And when you look at the examples on the screen, you'll see that there are a lot of words. And so, as we mentioned, the academic language and the literacy needed in order for students to be successful is not just in English language arts, but also in mathematics, also in science, and all of the different subjects that your student is learning in school. In particular, if you look at the second grade example here, you'll see the question in English says, Jerry wonders how many $10 bills are equal to a $1,000 bill. Work with your partner to answer Jerry's questions. Explain your solution using words, pictures, or numbers. Ask yourselves, can I draw something? What can I draw? What can I learn from my drawing? Remember to write your answer as a statement. And so in mathematics, one of the standards of math practice is to be able to communicate your thinking and connect to the reasoning of others. And in this example, you'll see that when a student is explaining their thinking, they're really asked to use facts from the problem, things that they know from reading the problem. So they're creating an argument about their answer grounded in the evidence. You'll also notice in our upper grade example that there are several instances where there is academic language or academic vocabulary that students need to be able to use, to read and understand, as well as to use in their writing to explain their thinking. And if you look closely at the text here, and Ari, I think you can help me, there's an example of complex text or a sentence structure that might be more challenging for a student to decode.
Yes. So that first sentence in that math problem, the number of devices a particular manufacturing company can produce is a function of the number of hours spent making the devices. So there's a lot packed into that sentence, and the student needs to be able to identify what is important, what is not important. For example, a particular manufacturing company is not, it sets where the math problem is contextualized, where it's taking place, but it may not be important for them to be able to solve the problem. What they do need to recognize are those phrases, a number of devices, produce, is a function of, right? And so the words that are associated with a particular kind of thinking to be able to solve that math problem. And so breaking that statement up into its pieces is a critical piece of, or a critical step in being able to solve that math problem. So in science, the same thing goes. Students will be reading informational texts. In this case, this is a second grade text focused on bodies of water in the wintertime. Rivers can freeze in the winter. In some places, they can be driven on. When ships cannot sail, rivers become highways for trucks. In some northern regions, using frozen rivers as highways is essential. Once the ice melts, the job of transportation is left to the ships. So this is an example of a piece of content-rich nonfiction that students would read to build an understanding of the world. At the same time, they're building an understanding of the way that water works in multiple places and the multiple properties of water. And so a teacher might ask a question, what are the different forms of water? And students would have to go back into the text to be able to say water can be in a liquid form, it can melt, it can be frozen, and they have to be able to find sentences that provide evidence to support that claim. And so as we teach students how to read these texts and think about how they're organized, we're also going to be asking them to develop arguments and support their claims in those arguments with evidence from the text. This text is very similar to the previous text in that it has complex sentences and academic language as well. In middle school and in high school, the text is organized with headings and subheadings, and sometimes with bold words that are important concepts. And just like in English language arts, the text becomes more complex. There is more knowledge about science that students need in order to be able to understand and then to work with a particular text. So this text as well is all about water, but it actually starts using more complex language, chemical compound, molecule, atoms, that students would have to know, understand, and then to be able to use in an experiment, in a simulation, in the science class. And again, to be able to make arguments about the properties of water.
So we know, we've heard from you, our families, that it is very hard sometimes to support your students in their English language arts or other work when they have a difficult time reading and understanding the text. And so we're going to share with you a tool that's available to your student called Read and Write. And it's a tool that they can use in Seesaw. It's a tool that they can use in Schoology. It's a tool that they can use in all of the Google files that they might be working on when they're in their classroom. And so I'm actually just going to demonstrate with our slide deck how this could work and why you might want to consider helping your student to understand how to use this, and maybe asking your child's teacher to help them to understand how to use this tool. So I'm actually going to come out of the presentation for a moment. And Ari, thumbs up if you can actually just see my browser with the screen up right now. Thank you. All right. So let's say that I was coming to this, let's see here. I'm going actually to come to the Grapes of Wrath. And I am not quite sure how to read the words that are on the screen, that are in the book, that are in the assignment that my teacher gave me. This tool, which is already installed on our district Chromebooks. So if you have a district Chromebook, it should already be available for your student. But we will also, when we share out the deck to our website, make sure that you have the link to install this at home. You can install it on Google Chrome, and it works through Google Chrome. So what I'm going to do is I want some help in reading this slide and the words on the slide. So I'm going to turn on my tool. It's Read and Write, and you'll see in the student browser a little purple puzzle piece. And when you turn it on, you'll see this toolbar on the top of the screen. And what I can do right now is I can actually, if I come in, actually, I don't even need to highlight the text. I'm going to hit play.
Stories Countess Gr. Stained had and stood with a curious humility in front of the screen. Could you see your way to sell us a look?
Lacey and Angela, you don't have to translate the reading. I just want to demonstrate how the tool itself actually works. Now, that was a little bit fast for me. I don't know about you. And so one thing that we can also do is change the settings to slow down the reading a little bit. And I'm going to try to play it again and see if I can understand it better at this speed.
Stories Countess Gr. Stained had and stood with a curious humility in front of the screen. Could you see your way to sell us a loaf of bread, Mom? May said,
So you can see how this could be helpful, maybe especially for some of our younger students in the early elementary level, but really for anybody who just needs some support in making sense of the words that are in front of them. The other thing is sometimes a student will have a PDF document, or maybe they're on a web page or something like that. And let's take the science example. And the PDF reader, the tool would have maybe a hard time reading the PDF. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just close this and open it again. And there's a really neat tool. Let's see. Let me come out of the slide. Come back. So there's a neat tool called a screenshot reader. So I'm going to turn on my tool one more time. And, uh-oh, I don't know why it's not turning on right now. Let's see here. All right, I'm going to refresh my screen just to pull up the slides one more time. Thank you for your patience, but I really do want to show you the power of this screenshot reader. So what it'll allow you to do is take a screenshot, take a picture of any words that are on the screen, and the tool will actually read that image. It will read the words on the image. So let's try this again as we're loading. I'm going to turn on my tool one more time, the Read and Write tool. And again, thank you all for your patience as you wait for my computer to load more slowly than what I would like. And I'm here at the science example again. So I'm going to turn on my Read and Write for Google Chrome. Once I have the text selected. Okay. And I see it's reconnecting. And if I can't show this right now, Ari, what we might be able to do is just jump ahead to the next slide and we'll come back later so that I can demonstrate it. But let me see if this is going to show up because I see my slides, unfortunately, still loading. Okay. Let's, we're gonna come back to this and show the screenshot reader. Thank you. I'm sure none of you ever experienced technical difficulties with your computer and losing connection and slow pages that are slow to load. All right, so we're going to come back again to that example in just a moment.
Okay, so we'll come back to that. We're going to transition to talk about writing. So we've already had some families explain that writing is difficult, and that is true. We want to show you some examples of writing, and not to say that this is the writing that is perfect writing, but it demonstrates what some focus areas might be. And again, we'll give you some tips at the end for how you can help support your child with their writing. So again, this might be difficult to see, but what it can do is give you an idea for right now about the length of writing that might be expected. So this is, and some of the qualities. So this is a sample 5th grade piece of writing, and it's an informative or explanatory piece of writing. And I want to point out just a couple of the skills that the student is demonstrating. And so what you'll see, and what we want to focus on with literacy development, is that kids have an opportunity to read a text, they have an opportunity to talk about the text, and they have an opportunity to write about the text. And as they're reading about it and talking about it, they're starting to develop their ideas. And as they're reading and talking about it, their teachers are teaching them ways to think about the text. And what we want to see in their writing is that they're using those ways of thinking about the text in their writing. And so we can see here, the first sentence says, Roald Dahl is a very interesting author to me. That's because he knows what a kid wants to hear. So right away, the student writer introduces the topic clearly with a focus, helping an audience understand what you're about to explain to them is a helpful way of giving them some direction in their writing. And so whether you're in, your child is in kindergarten or in 11th grade, you'll see teachers encouraging students to start off with sentences that give readers a clear understanding of what the topic is going to be. Later on in this piece of writing, the writer says, Sophia and the BFG, the big friendly giant, are trying to stop other giants from eating human beings. So the writer links ideas within and across categories using words, phrases, and clauses. So this skill, using linking words, is about connecting the ideas that are in the writing so that the reader can understand how the writer is thinking about these ideas, right? They're linking one idea to the next idea using very particular words and phrases. Those words and phrases might be the word because, or since, or as a result, right? But there are certain words and phrases that we want to teach students to use that can connect their ideas for the reader. You'll also notice that this student uses facts, definitions, details, quotations, all related to the topic. The writer says, and my favorite is, they were like a chorus of dentists' drills and all grinding away together. So when the student says, this was my favorite part of the story, the student then gives an example. As I mentioned before, we talked about using the language of the discipline. So if you're in an English class, or if you're talking about a fictional story, then you're using language that people who write about those and talk about fictional stories use. If you're writing about a math concept or topic, you're using words that mathematicians use, right? And so the writer says, I've noticed that the plot or the main problem of the story is, so that word plot, the writer is giving us an idea that he or she understands the words that are used to talk about stories. And finally, if you were to read this whole thing, you would see that the student is able to, or has command of the conventions of written English. So the student knows when to use commas. The student knows when to use periods. The student knows when to have a word end with an S to make it plural. These are just examples. But those are the kinds of skills: introducing your topic clearly with a focus, using facts and definitions or getting evidence from the text, linking your ideas together, right? Using domain-specific vocabulary. Those are all skills that students will be practicing when they're speaking and listening to each other in conversation. When you ask a student a question in a classroom and you say to them, what is the main idea of this text? We want them to be able to introduce their idea clearly. We want them to be able to use words to link their ideas together, so on and so forth. So they'll be practicing that as they speak and listen, and then practice as they write. If we move into the upper grades, this is a sample 11th grade argument writing. And again, you'll see very similar techniques that the student uses, but at a more advanced level. So not only does this student open up and talk about what they believe, have their claim at the beginning, but they're also able to explain why their claim is important. So the writer says, allowing a child to interact with their surroundings is difficult for adults because it leaves each decision and each consequence of that decision up to them, right? So oftentimes when we have an opinion, we also want to be able to communicate why that opinion is important, why it's important to us or why it's important to other people. So we want students to be able to do that too. We also want students to be able to explain other claims, right? To be able to say, this is what I believe. Let me also tell you what other people believe. Because as a reader, you want to know that this person who's writing has done their work to learn about this topic. And so this student is able to explain other claims. They're able to introduce a knowledgeable, precise claim. Later on in the text, they're able to use evidence and reasoning. I want to highlight that example. In the second paragraph, the student says, to relieve the inevitable boredom that every child eventually encounters, they can nourish their creative minds by playing alone. As a child, I was content to sometimes play by myself in a land of make-believe. So the writer uses evidence from their own lives to support their opinion, and they also think about what the audience might know. And so you can see if the student were reading about a particular text and then speaking with their peers about it, they'd be able to get an understanding of what an audience might know about this. And then they'd be able to translate that into their own thinking on a piece of paper or on a computer. So this is how the skills develop over time in a piece of writing. What's most important is that you can see that we're looking to develop kids' literacy, their skills to be able to have a claim, to provide examples to support their claim, and then later on, to be able to think about what other views are out there in the community and why their claim still matters and why it's important. I just got a message that Celine is ready to show us read and write, or the screen reader. So we're going to transition back to that real quick.
Thank you, Ari. So let me pull up the proper screen here. And thank you again, everyone, all of our families, for your patience while I reloaded my screen. Thumbs up, Ari, if you see my browser with the science slides up. Thank you. All right, so as I was mentioning, this is a PDF document. I can't select the words in the slide, but what I can do is take a picture and the tool is going to read my picture for me. So I'm going to come up here. This is called a screenshot reader. And so when I select it, you see the little crosshairs, and I'm going to just select this first part of the slide. And it will take a moment for the program to process the words that I've just selected. And so you can see the progress bar on the bottom as it's making sense of those words. Again, Angela and Lacey, you don't have to translate what the computer is about to read. I just want to demonstrate how the tool can help support our students who might be struggling with reading some of these words or even some of these long texts. And I'm just laughing because, of course, as I'm trying to demonstrate this tool, it's taking much longer than it normally does as we're on the screen for it to process. So in a moment or two, it should start reading about the river.
Rivers can freeze in the winter. In some places they can be driven on. When ships cannot sail, rivers become highways for trucks. In some northern regions, using frozen rivers as highways is essential. Once the ice melts, the job of transportation is left to ships.
So that's just an example of a tool that every San Leandro student and family has access to. And we're really excited about what it can do to provide access to reading, even though many of you talked about writing, but we want students to be able to read these texts so that they can communicate about them in writing. So that's the tool. Again, we will share out the slides, which have a link with more directions on how to use it. And I'm going to go ahead and jump back into the main slide deck so that we can continue on with our regular presentation.
Huge hooray that it worked. You can advance, Celine. Okay, so we're going to quickly show you a little clip of students in action, engaged in speaking and listening. So what I want you to listen for as you watch this is listen for students grounding their evidence in the text, trying to make sense of complex text, using academic language, all of that, okay? Take a listen. Celine, will you unmute it?
Okay, but it's not hers.
So what?
Hey guys, what did I miss?
Hi, Delaney.
Hi.
Nick says Rachel's making a big deal about the sweater.
Rachel?
The narrator in Sandra Cisneros' story 11?
Oh, right.
Rachel doesn't want to make a big deal about the sweater, but she can't help her feelings.
Whoa. Can someone read the prompt first?
I got it here. How does the incident of the red sweater reveal the multiple years inside 11-year-old Rachel? And then we're supposed to analyze Rachel's reactions and thoughts and use lots of textual evidence.
Reveal the multiple years inside Rachel. What does that mean?
Well, Rachel has a theory about being multiple years at once, right?
Oh, yeah. She explains it at the beginning of the story.
Celine,
When
you
you're
can-
11, you're also 10 and 9 and 8 and 7 and 6.
Okay, so you might have noticed that the students were referring back to the text. You might have noticed that the students were trying to make sense of the prompt that they were given. You might have noticed that the students asked each other questions. So these are the thinking routines. These are the muscles that we want students to exercise that will help them make sense of texts on their own. You'll see teachers putting, probably in distance learning, putting students into breakout rooms to have conversations just like this. And in the lower grades, you might see teachers asking students these kinds of questions as they get them ready for having group discussions. They might have them whole class discussions. Next slide, Celine. Okay, so we want to know, we have 5 minutes in our presentation. We hope that you can stick around. We might go a couple minutes after, but we have some great resources for you. We do want to know, when you ask your child about reading, writing, listening, and speaking in school, what do they tell you about their experience? Please write into the chat what you are hearing about the kinds of things your students are reading, what they're doing with writing in class, how they practice listening and speaking to each other. And Celine, as people are writing in, why don't we advance to the next slide so we can start moving into some resources. So we are guessing that sometimes your students might tell you that they are learning nothing. My kids tell me that they're learning nothing sometimes. I say, what did you do at school today? Nothing. What did you work on? Nothing. Well, that might be the same for you. So we have some charts that can give you some conversation starters to have with your students that all will help develop the same kind of literacy skills that we've been talking about in this presentation. So Celine just put a link into the chat box to a Google Drive folder with charts. And these charts have some questions that you can ask your children. They're called look fors and listen fors, the file names. But we're calling them our nothing charts, right? So when you open those up, And Celine, would you mind actually opening one up? Oh, there you go. Great. You can just open up the look fors and listen fors for the upper grades. So, just like we've been talking about literacy development, reading, writing, listening, and speaking, we have questions to start conversations with your children. We have questions that you can ask about content they're learning. We have questions to have your child explain something to you, and questions to help you move through your students' work. And so, if your student is working on some writing, you can ask them, what were you supposed to include in the writing? You can ask them, can you tell me what one of the texts that you read was all about? You can ask them, what kind of writing did you practice today? Right? You can just start off by asking them, oh, tell me all the times that you had to write, that your teachers asked you to write. So these are there for you as conversation starters to help support conversations with your children.
And the next resource that we want to share is really in first grade, second grade, seventh grade, high school. What specifically should my child be learning for that grade level? And the California PTA has provided these parent guides to success. And in a moment, as we close, I'll put the link in the chat so you can find this. But you'll notice that, for example, here we've posted the pages for English language arts for second grade, seventh grade, high school English. What's great is that on this page, there's also Spanish, there's also Arabic, and the resource comes in Chinese, Tagalog, and Vietnamese as well. And so for all of those languages, you will be able to see specifically for their grade what your child should be learning. And again, in just a moment, I will put that link in the chat.
So as we wrap up our session, we always like to ask, what is working for your family? We've given you some ideas about what to look for and listen for, what our focus areas are for literacy development, but we'd love to know what works for you and your family. How do you help your own child develop their literacy? We'd love to hear from you and what works, because we are not the only ones with wisdom. You have so much wisdom as parents in the community.
At this point too, in maybe the last couple minutes that we have, as you share your ideas for how you support your student at home with literacy, if you have questions that came up after watching this presentation, please do also put them in the chat so we can answer them as best as possible. And I think at this point, just to respect everyone's time, and we know that everyone is on the computer so much these days, Ari and I can stay for a few minutes to answer any outstanding questions that show up in the chat. Again, we will be posting this presentation as well as the recording of the video to our Family Learning Series website, and that link is in the chat. And so you can go back and revisit anything that was shared, as well as get the links for that amazing tool, the Nothing charts, and the parent guides for success. So thank you all so much for being here, for your attendance, for your time, and for everything that you're doing at home to support your student. We, as educators in the district who work with the students and work with teachers who work with your students, know that it's a major challenge and a major lift, and we appreciate the role of home teacher that you are really taking on so much these days.
Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful end of the year. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.